ADHD is a term that's tossed around a lot these days, but the fact is that many people don't really understand the way we understand it today. Sometimes you'll hear it called ADD, as in attention deficit disorder, and sometimes you'll hear it called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The fact is most of us use both terms interchangeably. And what we now know is that this cluster of difficulties that we speak about as attention deficit disorder is really a problem with the unfolding of the management system of the brain. It's not simply about behavior. It's not simply, are you listening when somebody's talking to you? It has to do with being able to get organized and get started. It has to do with being able to stay tuned and listen to something and then shift focus when you need to. It has to do with being able to regulate your alertness so that you can pay attention when you need to and can let yourself relax when you need to. It has to do with regulating emotions so they don't get in the way too much for what we're trying to do. And it has a lot to do with memory, being able to keep one thing in mind while doing something else at the same time with other things in mind. Basically, these are basic skills of managing daily life. Another thing that's important to know about ADHD is it's inherited. Out of every 4 people diagnosed with ADD, one of them has a mom or dad who has it. ADHD runs in families. But there's one thing about this that's really confusing to people, and that is I've seen thousands of patients with ADD, little kids, teenagers, and adults. And what I can tell you is that every one of them has a few things they can pay attention to very, very well. It might be playing a sport. It might be playing video games. It might be making art. It might be doing Lego constructions when they're little, and then when they're older, taking car engines apart and putting them back together, designing computer networks. But everybody I've ever seen who has ADHD has a few things like that where they can pay attention perfectly well and utilize all these skills that I'm talking about, even though they have a lot of trouble in doing the same thing in other places.
Key takeaways. ADHD is a cluster of difficulties that involve the self-management system of the brain. ADHD is often inherited. It can run in families. All people with ADHD have a few tasks or activities that are interesting to them and that they can pay attention to very well.
For a long time, ADHD was thought of as simply a problem with little boys. And it has taken a long time for people to realize that there are many girls who have very similar problems. The reason for that is that for a long time the emphasis was on hyperactivity and behavior problems, which you see much more frequently with boys. And even today, boys are more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD as are girls. But the fact is there are many girls who struggle in school. They may not make as much trouble and therefore aren't noticed as much by parents and teachers as having difficulty, but they may be more spaced out. They may have more difficulty in being able to focus on tasks, on being able to remember what they've just heard or what they've just read, have more difficulty getting organized and getting started on their work, and often are seen as just not very good students, when in fact they may be students who can function very well for something in which they have strong interest, or if their ADHD symptoms have been adequately treated.
Key takeaways. Hyperactivity is more common in boys, but it's not the only symptom of ADHD. Girls with attention issues might get overlooked because they don't act up as much as boys do. Boys are more than twice as likely as girls to be diagnosed with ADHD.
Parents often wonder, how can you get a diagnosis about whether or not a child has ADHD or doesn't? There is no one test that makes a determination, does a person have ADHD? There is no imaging picture that you can take of their brain. There is no blood test. There is no computer test. There's no electroencephalogram. This is not something which is determined by any one single test. What's really involved in learning about somebody enough to know if they have a diagnosis is a well-conducted interview of a mental health or medical professional who understands ADHD with the parents, with the child, also making use of information from school, if they're in school, and from other people who can tell us more about how this child is functioning in aspects of everyday life. It's usually a conversation, an interview, or possibly a series of a few interviews between the professional and the parents and the boy or girl to be able to learn more about what is daily life like for them and how does it compare with what you'd normally expect for somebody else in that age. We want to know a little bit about what's going on in the family, what stressors there might be that are causing pressures. We want to inquire about whether there are any health problems that have been difficult that may be contributing to some of the difficulties of this child. We want to know what other people in the family have had. Are there several other people? We know that ADHD is inherited. And are there several other people in the family, close relatives perhaps, who have similar problems which would increase the likelihood? All the characteristics of ADHD. If you look at that list of symptoms and show it to anybody and say, have you ever had this? Everybody's hand would be up and say, sure, of course. But those symptoms that we all have sometimes, difficulty focusing, difficulty getting started, getting distracted too much, quitting too soon on a task, those are all things that everybody has some trouble with. The purpose of the diagnostic interview is to find out from the person and the parents and the teachers how this person really functions day by day compared to others of the same age.
Key takeaways. There is no one test that determines if a person has ADHD. To get a diagnosis, a person needs to be interviewed by a health professional who knows a lot about ADHD. The interviewer asks about school and home to help determine how a child is functioning compared to kids the same age.
Years ago, people used to believe that ADHD just went away when you got to be about 12 or 14 years old. And the reason for that is that often those who are hyperactive tend to get less hyperactive as they get a little bit older. But what we now know is that ADHD is not primarily about being hyperactive. Some people who have ADHD have never been hyperactive. And even for those who have been hyper, usually that's the least of it. It's the attention problems that make the most difficulty for most people with ADHD. And what we now know is that those problems with attention often get more difficult as you get a little bit older. Most of the people who are diagnosed in early childhood with ADHD continue to have at least some symptoms as they get older. Sometimes they go well into adulthood. Sometimes some of those symptoms diminish and are not making as much trouble. But this is something which for most people, these attention problems really do make difficulty for them as they're getting older. Usually the hardest times for people with ADHD are junior high, high school, and the first couple of years of college or whatever else they're going to be doing right after high school. Because those are the years when you have the widest range of tasks to do with the least opportunity to escape from the ones you're not that good at. And for example, when you're in high school, you have to learn about math. You have to be able to do algebra. You have to be able to learn geometry. You have to be able to write essays for English. You may be asked to learn a foreign language. And when you're in college, often there are a lot of general education requirements that everybody's got to take a certain amount of these liberal arts subjects in order to be able to complete their program. As you get older, you can specialize a little more and build on your talents, build on your interests, and stay away from some of those things that may be more difficult. The people who are good with words can hopefully, if they're lucky, get a job where they can work with words, whether it's sales or writing or something like that. The people who are not so good with words but are very good with numbers can get a job where they can work with numbers. The people who are better at mechanical things may be doing drafting and engineering tasks. They do far better, and some are very successful, as they get into a point where they can specialize, and if they're lucky enough that they can get a job where they can build on those talents and those interests, they can be extraordinary.
Key takeaways. Most people with ADHD continue to have at least some symptoms as they get older. Kids may get less hyperactive, but still struggle with attention issues. Things tend to get easier after high school when young adults can choose classes or find work that fits their interests.